Everybody. So today I'm going to do a bit of a fact check, and the fact check is on the claim that, well, firstly, did Donald Trump say that Ukraine were responsible for the war? Now, sort of. His quote, roughly speaking, was Ukraine shouldn't have started the war. It was a terrible war, they shouldn't have started it. It was along those lines. Now, clearly implying that he believes that Ukraine started the war. Now, technically speaking, they did invade Russia. They're currently occupying the Russian oblast of Kursk. So there's no doubt that they have invaded Russia. But that wasn't the start of the war. I'm pretty confident that that's probably not what Trump was talking about. He said they shouldn't have started it. The invasion of Kursk happened about 2.5 years into it. It's only in the last 6 months, and the war's been going for 3 years. So, probably not talking about that. If he was, well, absolutely factually accurate. Ukraine launched an unprovoked attack on Kursk. There's no question about that. The people of Kursk weren't attacking Ukraine. They were innocent civilians, they were attacked. There's no doubt that that was a war of aggression by Ukraine against Russia. And in fact, it's quite troubling that we had so few people cared. We'd all said, oh, well, Ukraine's the defensive group, but then they go ahead and invade Kursk. Now, the invasion of Kursk, but Ukraine are not innocent. They're guilty. They're the guilty party. In fact, if we were limiting ourselves to the invasion of Kursk, there'd be no argument that Ukraine are the innocent party. In fact, the only reason that anybody suggests that that was a legitimate thing to do is based on the fact that Russia had invaded Ukraine. At least if we accept that it was an invasion. And I can go into why it might not have been. But suffice to say that that was definitively a war of aggression. And if we consider that to be a separate war, it was unquestionably unjustified. It's unjustifiable. Ukraine did the wrong thing there. But assuming that Trump is not referring to the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk, can we say that Ukraine started the war? And the simple answer is yes, we actually can. In fact, there are 4 groups, 3 countries and 1 group of country, who have been criticised as being responsible for the war. Now, obviously, we know Russia. That is one of the 4 countries or groups of country. The second group is USA, fairly well aware of that USA did meddle with things to cause the war. The third group is Ukraine, and I can go into that later, but Ukraine have been described by numerous sources, not just Russia, as having started the war. And the fourth group is NATO. Now, of the 4, I can go into which one's which, but that might be too long for the sake of this video. Suffice to say, NATO is the least likely, and it's solely based around the idea that NATO wanted Ukraine as part of them so as to upset Russia. Whilst that is a factor, it's clear that Russia didn't invade solely to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. That wasn't the cause of the war. We know that. We've heard that from Russia. We know that for a fact. It was a small part of it, but it was not the major thing. So NATO cannot be blamed for that as a group. And in fact, most, or at least a number of parts of NATO do not want Ukraine as part of it. And yeah, so the idea to invade Ukraine solely to stop them from joining NATO is, well, not completely ridiculous, but certainly not the main reason. Now, the main reason actually was USA. So the actual reason that the war started, it was forced by USA. So that was the main thing, and I know that might sound bad to say that, but USA were the main ones. Because USA wanted to force China to hate Russia more than they already do, and they already don't like each other, so as to prevent China from having a meaningful alliance with Russia. Because if China ever did have a meaningful alliance with Russia, then they would challenge USA as the world leaders. USA want to stay the world leaders for as long as possible, if not forever. And whilst even a a full alliance between China and Russia would not mean that their combined might is as strong as USA's. It would make it very close. And if China sent people into Russia, Russia lacks people, China lacks land. If you sent, let's say, 500 million Chinese people into Russia, Russia would be able to operate at full capacity, even beyond Soviet Union levels. China would have a lot more space, and both countries would very quickly, within the space of about 8 to 10 years, 12 years tops, become superior to USA. And once they become superior to USA, they would very quickly become much stronger, to the extent where within 20 or 30 years, they would be 2 to 3 times stronger than USA, and USA would not be able to stop them from controlling the world. Now, USA are very well aware of that, so are China and Russia. In fact, world leaders are aware of this, and that is why, since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, USA has deliberately set events in motion to make China and Russia not like each other. There is no doubt that the Ukraine war was one of these events. In fact, this is the major event that has been used in desperation to prevent them from becoming too close, and it failed. So the point of the war was not to kill Ukrainians or to kill Russians or anything like that. That was not the main aim of the war. Now, it helps them because Ukraine are traditionally allied with Russia, and in fact, it would be expected that at some point in the future, if USA did not get involved, Ukraine would return to Russian control. So killing people before that happens is useful. And you're killing both sides, knowing that they will eventually merge. So that is helpful to USA. The more people that die, the better. But they also, most importantly, wanted China to hate Russia and never want to get involved with them. And the opposite has happened. And we've reached a scenario where now China are poised to have an unequal alliance with Russia, where China dominate. And in fact, they're not very far away for being able to annex part of Russia. And Russia wouldn't fight very hard about it. They might not like it, but they're in a situation where, thanks to USA sanctions, and of course other countries will support them too, but thanks to those sanctions, Russia are reliant on China, so they could simply cede, let's say, Siberia to China. And once they start ceding territory, you could have a war of annexation where China want to control all of Russia. And if the annexation occurs, it might sound good for USA, but once that's finished in their one country, USA are going to cease to become relevant very quickly. So that's what this war's about. And the problem is that the longer this war goes, the worse it is for USA. So USA really want to end this war. They want to end it more than Russia do. They want to end it more than Ukraine do. And both Russia and Ukraine are aware of this. So they want to get terms so that they get good terms. Now, Ukraine likely in a few years will cease to exist. They'll be merged with Russia. And if they do exist, it'll only be a part of them and so forth. That's inevitable. And I don't think this war wasn't about that. A lot of people have said it was, but it wasn't really. Russia know that most Ukrainians want to become part of Russia again. They describe it as an independence experiment rather than something that Ukraine really wanted to do. Ukraine don't have the finances to support running their own country. They need to be a part of some other country. And that has been the case for 1,200 years. They don't have the amount of natural resources to support their country. Their population is too big. In order for them to exist as a country, they would need to have perhaps 6 or 7 million people instead of 45 million. And the population grew and ballooned because the Soviet Union were propping them up. And they're far too poor. So you would have a situation where their cost of living would drop down to Mozambique levels or Bangladesh levels because of overpopulation and under-resource. So Ukraine would much prefer to belong to some other country. Now, through their history, they belong to a number of other countries, but the one that has supported them the most and been the happiest and friendliest with them has been Russia. So you give Ukraine a choice. Do they want to return to Polish control or Russian control? Anyone with any amount of historical knowledge would know that Russians treated them much better. Now, some want to become a part of USA. I don't think that that's a good idea for them. USA tend to be quite nasty to countries that they puppet, with the possible exception of Israel. But anyway, so And I know you could be saying, oh, is this a war about who gets to control Ukraine between Russia and USA? But it's not really. USA don't want to control Ukraine. They can't trust Ukraine because most Ukrainians are secretly pro-Russia and anti-American. So if they controlled Ukraine, they would get stabbed in the back. So USA are not interested in controlling Ukraine. That's not what this war is about. It's about making Russia look bad. Now that's not really doubted. It's not in any serious dispute. Now, I know a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about and who are not aware of certain things going on might claim it, but amongst people that are in the know, in the political leaders and that sort of thing, that is simply the fact. Now, what does this have to do with Ukraine potentially starting the war? Well, the war actually started when Ukraine declared the Donbass as a terrorist region, a terrorist oblast, terrorist two oblasts actually, so it's Donetsk and Luhansk, and they declared that they were terrorists and then were poised to invade that area, and after invasion they would round them up, send them to re-education camps, such as, and I'm not going to say what happened in Nazi Germany, but it's more closer to what happened in Sri Lanka in the early 2000s with the Tamil Tigers. Once they would be rounded up, they would be forced to remove any thoughts that Russia were nice and any thoughts of independence, and after that they would return. And so it would essentially be brainwashed. Now, this is not something that anyone approves of doing in the modern era, and it's cruel, inhumane, and a crime against humanity. Additionally, anyone who refused would be summarily executed. Now, that is something that Russia went in to prevent. Now, that is obviously a major war crime, not just a small technicality, but a very serious, wrong thing by Ukraine. So from that point of view, if you focus on that, you can legitimately claim that Ukraine started the war. However, Ukraine didn't say that wasn't their idea, say essentially. USA forced them to do it. Joe Biden clearly and obviously ordered them to do that. So even in that scenario, USA still started the war. So it's a very narrow line and ignores a lot of other things to suggest that this is primarily Ukraine's responsibility. However, technically, from a certain perspective, you can say that it was Ukraine. If you focus solely on the Donbass region, solely on Ukraine declaring them to be terrorists, and solely on the idea that they may, after invasion, put them into concentration camps and re-educate them. Now, of course, Ukraine didn't actually invade Donbass, they just said they were going to. They declared them as terrorists, said that they were about to invade, and then the Donbass asked Russia to help them stop the invasion, which triggered the war, but they didn't actually invade. It may well have been that Ukraine were bluffing, that they weren't going to invade, in which case you could say that Ukraine didn't really start the war, they were just bluffing. But they kind of also forced Russia to go in there. And of course, if Russia had stuck to just that area and not gone into Kiev, I think that global sympathy would have been on Russia's side. You would have said, well, Ukraine are the aggressors. And I think that would have been the world view. But because Russia were, I'll say, stupid to go into Kiev, at least initially, then there is this claim that Russia started the war. And I mean, Russia have said, well, they only did it to stop Ukraine from attacking the Donbass, but they still really didn't have a justification for going into Kiev. They had a justification for going into Crimea. Crimea belonged to Russia in the first place, but they had no justification for going into Kiev, or at least not a very strong justification. And it was the invasion of Kiev, even though it only lasted 2 months and then Russia withdrew, that does paint the picture that Russia were responsible. However, again, America forced them to do that, dared them to do that, and said, as long as you don't take Poland, we're happy with you. So there's a much stronger argument to say that USA started the war than Russia. But there's also a stronger argument to say that Russia started the war than Ukraine. Because the only argument that says that Ukraine's more responsible than Russia relates to the Donbass, and that in turn still goes back to USA. So you probably overall would say, okay, 60 to 70% of the responsibility for the war is USA. you've still got probably 20% Russia and maybe 5% Ukraine. It's more Russia than Ukraine, there's no question about that. But it is also more Ukraine than NATO. So, you're sort of looking at a scenario where, yes, there is an argument, and it's a legitimate argument to say that Ukraine are responsible. And it's a better argument than the argument that blames NATO. And we have seen a lot of people legitimately and fervently argue that NATO are responsible. In fact, I think you could argue that all four of those areas are responsible. Russia, USA, NATO and Ukraine. Now, I've put my arguments towards why I think that USA is the most responsible, but it's also very clear that Russia are responsible, at least in part, and Ukraine are too, and so are NATO. But it's how responsible they are, and whilst it's not a lie to say that Ukraine are responsible, it's also it's particularly coming from an American voice, when America were the ones that told them to do it. And I know it was a previous regime, if you like. It was Biden, it wasn't Trump that told them to invade the Donbass. It comes across as quite cruel, because the only way that you can suggest that Ukraine are responsible is if you're talking about that part which was America's fault. So America telling Ukraine they were responsible for following orders, it's a bit like a boss saying to an employee, says, hey, type up these notes, and then goes around to other people and says, hey, this is a bad employee because he typed up these notes for me. So that's really unfair to blame Ukraine. Now, I can blame Ukraine from an Australian perspective because my country wasn't involved, but USA can't, because USA are the boss, they're the main ones in power. Now, even though you say, okay, Trump's not the same leader, he at least needs to acknowledge that Biden started it. And of course we know that Biden was lacking cognitive function, and therefore someone else was behind it, and therefore it wasn't really Biden. And I think most likely it was his son Hunter, and then Hunter was getting strings pulled by some shadowy figures, which, following the money, seems as if it was Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, perhaps amongst others. They were the ones that actually started the war, and those three are now allied with Trump. You've got a pretty fair argument that says, well, Trump supports the people who started the war, and those people are now telling him to stop the war because they've lost the war. In fact, there's a stronger argument that Elon Musk started the war than there is that Joe Biden did. Not by himself, it wasn't just Elon Musk, but that he was a part of the group that decided that having the war was a good idea. So, and it might have been, had it gone in a different direction. And that also explains why those three flipped from Joe Biden supporters to Donald Trump supporters. So yeah, Ukraine technically, yes, did start the war. That is it's not a lie, but realistically, not really very accurate. And not saying that they were the main group is ignoring America's involvement, certainly, and probably also ignoring Russia's and NATO. It's also ignoring what the official American propaganda says, which is that Russia started unprovoked and nobody else did. And as an American leader, Trump sort of has to go along with the official American propaganda. So he should be required to at least publicly state that Russia are behind it. Ukraine is more honest, but yeah, you shouldn't be saying, there's a number of reasons why he shouldn't be saying that Ukraine were involved, but it's not a lie. It's not a lie. It's not a lie to say that Ukraine started the war. And I've just explained how they did, but saying that they were solely responsible, which Trump didn't say, would be at the very least ignorant, if not completely lying. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.